Now Jung also believed so that there were these patterns of behavior, and they would constitute the typical behavioral patterns of human beings. And then we evolved a system of representations of those patterns, and that would enable us to understand the patterns in a way that other animals can't, because we're self-conscious, right? So what does it mean to be self-conscious? It doesn't just mean that you know that you exist as a separate entity. Like, it's not just a state of conscious awareness. It's a knowledge condition. You have at your fingertips a very large representational storehouse of abstract knowledge about what human beings are like. And that's developed over tens of thousands of years, right? It's a collective activity. The generation of all these stories we tell about each other. I mean, we have ancient stories. The oldest stories we have, by the way, are Mesopotamian stories, as far as I know. And the oldest Mesopotamian story, or one of the oldest Mesopotamian stories we have, is a hero story where the god, Marduk, fights a great dragon and cuts her into pieces and makes the world. And you might think, well, what do you, Mesopotamians, you know, what do you mean the world's created out of the pieces of a great dragon? Well, it's a Piagetian idea with a bit of narrative complexity added to it. It's like, well, how do you create the world? Well, you confront the unknown and you transform it into the known, or you confront unexplored territory and you transform it into explored territory. And then you might say, well, what exactly is the unknown, or what exactly is unexplored territory? And a scientist would say, well, you know, if you walk out in a field that you've never been in before, there's soil and material elements, and that's what's really there. But that isn't exactly what's really there. It depends on your time frame. So one of the things I could say about that, for example, is that if you wander outside the boundaries of your knowledge, if you wandered outside the boundaries of your territory when you were an animal, or when you were a more archaic human being, the probability that you were going to run into something that was going to tear you apart and eat you was extremely high. And so then I could say, well, the fundamental nature of the unknown is that which tears you apart and eats you. And you might think, well, is that, what sort of reality is that? And I would say, you know how you hear evolutionary psychologists talk sometimes about the fact that we evolved on the African veldt, and now our nervous systems are sort of adapted for that primordial environment and not really for the modern environment, and so there's a mismatch between us and the modern world. It's like, I think that's an absolutely reprehensible theory, partly because we didn't just evolve on the veldt. We've been evolving for a very long time. We spent a lot more time in trees, for example, than we did on the veldt, and while we were spending time in trees, a lot of us were eaten by snakes, for example. And so that's another reason why the unknown itself is represented as this terrible, predatory, reptilian beast. And then the human being is represented as that which, or the conscious element of the human being, which was represented by the Mesopotamians as a god, the highest god actually in the hierarchy of gods, which was a brilliant Mesopotamian realization, because the Mesopotamians basically concluded in their drama, their religious drama, that the highest faculty of the human being was the capacity to consciously attend to the unknown and to make something new out of it. Well, that's a Piagetian idea, right? That's exactly what Piaget was talking about when he talked about the necessity of comprehending knowledge as a process rather than as a collection of facts. It's a process. What's the process? Confront what you don't understand. Boldly go where no one has ever gone, right? I mean, Star Trek, that's where systematizing minds get their mythology. You know, it's rife with mythology, and its initial statement is a mythological statement, and it's a statement of the eternal explorer. And that's an archetypal idea. And, you know, you might say, well, are you still threatened by those terrible things that threatened your ancestors on the veldt? And normally people would say, well, no, because there are no lions. But that's because they don't get the categories right. Lion is a subcategory of unknown horrible thing. And you guys are surrounded by unknown horrible things just like people have always been surrounded by unknown horrible things. So because you're just as prone to disease, not quite as prone, but fundamentally you're a finite being. And there's things everywhere that act in a predatory manner in relationship to you, and you will die. And so the idea that the material conditions of our environment have changed in a qualitative manner since the time we spent on the veldt it's an error of category. The mythological categories are categories that represent environmental entities, so to speak, some of which are social, that have existed for vast stretches of time and which exceed our capacity to detect with our senses. So one representation, for example, is the Great Father, or the Wise Old Man. And the Wise Old Man, or the Great Father, is fundamentally a representation of the dominance hierarchy. Now, the problem with the dominance hierarchy is you can't see it, but it's there. It's really there. And then figures like the Great Mother, especially the tarot, because most of the archetypal figures come in pairs, a positive element and a negative element, and that's because virtually everything that manifests itself to you in a complex environment, if you're a living being, takes with one hand and gives with the other. You know, so nature is benevolent and kind and wise and the source of all new knowledge, and also cancer and malarial mosquitoes and the tsetse fly and the guinea worm and all these things that are horrifying and destructive beyond belief, and you're stuck with both. And then society, we talked about this before, that's the Great Father. It's on the one hand, here you are, benevolently protected by your social surround. On the other hand, social structures tend towards tyranny and authoritarianism, and they oppress the individuals within them at the same time that they sustain their development. And so that's a dichotomous archetype. And then there's the individual, who's on the one hand a remarkable and wonderful creature, and on the other hand someone who's capable of atrocities like those that characterized the actions of many millions of people in the 20th century.